There's a pretty good argument to be made that the Kansas City Chiefs' last two Super Bowl rings were basically won by the defense. But last year, that defense only got the Kansas City Chiefs to the Super Bowl, and that's just not acceptable here in Kansas City anymore. And the defense had a fair number of difficulties during the season. The cornerback two spot was a sore spot for quite a few weeks there after the loss of Jalen Watson. And the linebackers could not seem to cover a tight end for anything. But just like when an offense is struggling, oftentimes when when an offense is struggling, oftentimes whether the quarterback looks bad, the running backs look bad, or the wide receivers can't seem to get open, it's ultimately an offensive line problem. And the same can be said for the defense as well, as the entire play, whether it is a pass or a run, starts at the defensive line. But we saw the Kansas City Chiefs invest heavily in that defensive line this previous draft. Not with any UDFAs after the draft, really, but during the draft, they spent a second and a third round pick on those defensive line positions. In an article titled Chiefs Defensive Line Coach Joe Cullen is Impressed by Rookie Linemen, They Have Great Motors from Chiefs Wire by Ed Easton Jr., we get the following. This is a quote, of course, from Cullen, starting here. Well, the two are really good. I mean, when you study the draft and our scouting staff, led by our general manager Brett Veach, said Cullen, they do a good job, and they were guys that we identified and had opportunities to really get around and bring them in for a visit. Zoom with them. They both love football, and they're both football junkies, and they're really good players. The Chiefs added two defensive line standouts, selecting Tennessee's Omarr Norman-Lott in the second round with the 63rd pick and Louisville's Ashton Gillotte in the third round with the 66th pick. Well, they have great motors, they're powerful, explosive, and sudden. And both of them at their school, where they're represented, great in their role. Cullen likes to add a lot of words, not exactly a Hemingwayan speaker, more of a William Faulkner kind of guy. When you look at Omarr Norman-Lott, when you broke down his snaps this past year, he led the NCAA and pass rush win rate by interior tackles. And then Ashton Gillotte played all over the place. He played end and inside, for I was powerful. He was explosive, and when he went back to his junior he was explosive when he went back to his junior year. Pardon me, I'm talking about Cullen putting extra words in there, and I seem to be doing it as well. But his sophomore year, he had 11 and a half sacks. He was playing more on the edge. This year, they moved him inside a little bit. It's a 4-eye kind of like Felix did when he was at Kansas State. So both of those guys are now going to bring great energy to the room, and they're doing that now. Now, one thing that I want to really focus on from this quote. Well, they have great motors, they're powerful, explosive, and sudden. Now, of course, being this type of athlete facilitates being good at the sport of football in general and will help on a running down or a passing down. But the skills highlighted here are really, really useful in the pass rush department. And there's a really good reason why. When we zoom out and we look at the Chiefs' defense over the last 3 seasons, 2 years ago, 2022, 3 years ago, 2022, the Chiefs won the Super Bowl. They had 55 sacks as a defense. And you can look at some of these other stats, and things all kind of add up accordingly. In 2023, the Kansas City Chiefs had 57 sacks, a really good number. And then, in the 2024 season, the Kansas City Chiefs fell all the way down to 39 sacks as a defense, and that defensive line struggled basically left to right. The defensive line was not what it had been in the 2022 and 2023 seasons. The pass rush fell off pretty drastically, nearly 20 sacks fewer in 2024 than they had in 2023. And the struggle was, obviously manifested in the individual performers, but none of those performers struggled quite as much as did Chris Jones last season. Playing in 15, so he has 3 consecutive seasons of playing in fewer games, 17 in 2022, 16 in 2023, and then just 15 last year. But that's not really the biggest deal here because sacks don't come on a weekly basis. It's more of a snap-by-snap thing, right? Sometimes they cluster, and sometimes there's a drought there. We saw that in George Karlaftis' rookie season. But here we have the stats for Chris Jones. In 2022, he provided 15 and a half of those 55 sacks. So if you strip Chris Jones from the 2022 defense, they still had a half sack more than the Chiefs' entire defense did with Chris Jones in 2024. So 10 and a half sacks for Chris Jones in 2023, and then just 5 sacks last season. And we saw the hit on Chris Jones' stats everywhere, from 44 tackles in 2023 down to 30 in 2023, or 40 tackles in 2022, 30 in 2023, and 37 in 2024. But his solo tackles were down in each of those successive seasons, 30 to 20 to 19. Interestingly, 2/3 of his tackles were solo in 2023. So either he was making the play or he was not part of it. Sort of an interesting thing to see there. But his QB hits were down drastically in 2024 as well. 29 in 2022, another 29 quarterback hits in 2023, and then just 20 last year. But it wasn't just Chris Jones. George Karlaftis, though his drop-off was not as significant, it was still a drop-off in the sack department, but it was not a drop-off in quarterback hits. So, George Karlaftis in 2022 had 6 sacks his rookie season. 2023, he had 10 and a half sacks, and then fell back down to 8 sacks last year. However, his quarterback hits went up from 11 as a rookie to 17 in 2023. The paradigm of last season is sort of a struggle this point in the year. And then he had a 28 quarterback hit output in 2024. So that was more, notably, than Chris Jones' 20. So George Karlaftis got to the quarterback more often, but tackled him less often. Not the biggest deal overall. Really, what you're looking at for a defensive lineman is how often they can affect the play. Having a quarterback hit certainly affects the play, because if the hit is early enough that you're not drawing a penalty for a late hit on the quarterback, it means that you affected their throw and the offense was not in a better position because the defensive lineman got there. If he gets there too late, gets the penalty, the offense gets 15 yards, that's a first down, keeps the drive alive, keeps the drive moving, etc. So if you're just looking at these stats, it would kind of seem like maybe Chris Jones got that big money deal and calmed down a little bit. It would seem that way, but I don't think that's the case. George Karlaftis was more productive in other areas. 9 tackles for loss versus 7 the season before, 28 quarterback hits versus 17 the season before, whereas Chris Jones pretty much fell off across the board. But there is one other player that I think lets us in a little bit on what was going on here. Now, Chris Jones is an all-star, and every offensive coordinator in the league knows that. George Karlaftis is emerging a little bit. He did have that double-digit sack season in 2023, but still not a guy that an offense has to completely focus on in order that George Karlaftis not wreck their game plan. But there's another guy who was not, maybe you see where I'm going with this when I have to use the past tense, a focus for probably any of the offenses that the Kansas City Chiefs played. A guy who had last season more sacks than Chris Jones. Tershawn Wharton ended up having 6.5 sacks on the season. That was a career year for the young defensive lineman from Missouri, by the way, from the St. Louis side of the state. Tershawn Wharton ended up with a career year, 6.5 sacks, 29 tackles, 11 quarterback hits, 7 tackles for loss. All of these stats where a guy like Tershawn Wharton is really kind of popping out. What is there to be taken from that? Well, it suggests to me that when offenses looked at this defense, they knew if we stop Chris Jones, we can kind of have our way a couple places. The Chiefs had problems with injuries at cornerback, which made that number 2 cornerback spot a weakness. The Chiefs had some issues covering linebackers. They didn't have the most athletic bunch at linebacker. Well, Nick Bolton kind of brings the athleticism of the defensive line group down, but he is absolutely instrumental versus the run. So it's a good idea to have Nick Bolton on the field. He's also one of these guys that just kind of happens to find himself in the right place at the right time very often, scooping up fumbles, picking off passes, all of these sorts of things more often than you would think for a linebacker who is a little bit on the shorter side, for a linebacker who does not have the best testing numbers, right? He is an ultimate hustle guy. Still, the ultimate hustle guy can be taken advantage of by athletic tight ends, and opposing offenses knew that. So, in that situation, you don't have to get very deep on the Chiefs' defensive roster in order to find a mismatch. You have two wide receivers on the field. All of a sudden, you probably have a matchup problem for Najee Johnson, who is a 4th cornerback kind of guy in the NFL. You have enough players on the field to have an athletic tight end represented, and you get that matchup with Nick Bolton. And also, Drew Tranquill kind of fell off last year. I'm not able to ascertain exactly what happened with Drew Tranquill, but I think we all saw that. All of a sudden, your offense just has to have 2 wide receivers and a tight end on the field, and everyone else can be dedicated towards blocking the defensive line, but really Chris Jones. And once that happens, if you can neutralize Chris Jones, once that happens, there are holes all over the field for the opposing offense. Drafting Omarr Norman-Lott, a pass rush defensive tackle, drafting Ashton Gillotte, a guy who is not really the fastest, but who does comparably stack up pretty well physically with George Karlaftis, means that while and whereas the Chiefs did lose Tershawn Wharton to the Carolina Panthers to a pretty big contract number, they should be able to plug in players that are ultimately more intimidating than Tershawn Wharton with Omarr Norman-Lott, and they have another guy in the edge rotation in Ashton Gillotte who should really be able to add some pop. So the Chiefs also last year, Charles Omenihu was injured. Charles Omenihu doesn't seem to play full seasons for the Kansas City Chiefs, and that made the defensive end rotation struggle a little bit. You had B.J. Thompson go down in the preseason with an anomalous injury or medical event, I guess it would more aptly be called. And there was a 2-player pop to the edge rotation right there. Mike Dana is serviceable at edge, and he does what he does, but he's never going to be a guy that absolutely terrifies an offense. He's just not going to be that guy. FAU, I said when he was drafted, his ceiling is probably Mike Dana, and so far that has proven out. In fact, it kind of hasn't proven out, because if you cannot find a way to get your young first-round pick on the field over Mike Dana, it probably means that Dana is at least more consistent than FAU. I do think we saw some bright spots in FAU's game. You have to imagine that heading into his third season, this is maybe a make-or-break year for the young defensive lineman. Remember, he did come out exceptionally young, 21 years old as a rookie, but that is not to say that everything is copacetic with FAU. He does have to get better. I don't at this point see FAU having a second contract in Kansas City. This year could swing that around, right? But he's got more competition at the position with Ashton Gillotte stepping in. The Chiefs didn't really take a hit at the defensive end position in free agency. It was defensive tackle with Tershawn Wharton, defensive tackle with Derek Nottie. And that has left a hole on the roster that hasn't been filled until you have Omarr Norman-Lott. Now, it is interesting to see the transition from the old ways of trying to find a second defensive tackle for the Kansas City Chiefs to drafting Omarr Norman-Lott. If you think back, the Chiefs have taken a lot of swings at plus-size defensive tackles, and none of them have panned out, and it's not surprising. Having a guy who is that big and still athletic enough to play NFL football is a rare event. And it seems very difficult to find the translation from college football standout great big defensive tackle to NFL football standout big defensive tackle. So it maybe the Kansas City Chiefs have given up trying to find the 340-pound run-stuffing defensive tackle that they seemed for so long to have wanted, and maybe transitioning towards having just athletic defensive tackles. That is certainly the move they made with Omarr Norman-Lott. There is reason to believe that the Kansas City Chiefs will be multiple on the defensive line front as well, moving their edge players inside. We've seen George Karlaftis line up inside. We just saw Joe Cullen talk about the fact that Ashton Gillotte has made some plays from the inside position in college. So we don't really know if that is in the cards for him in the NFL, but I'm willing to bet they're going to give it a try at some point. So these two draft picks are a move for the Kansas City Chiefs to get back to the 50-plus sack range on a season. Will it work? I kind of think yes. I kind of think that these two guys will help the Kansas City Chiefs get to the quarterback more often. But we will have to see. That is all I have for this video. If you like or appreciate what it is that I do here, hitting the like button really does help me out, as it tells YouTube to share this video with other Kansas City Chiefs fans. And if you find yourself here by chance but not design, the Chiefs are the only thing I talk about on this channel, dropping multiple videos every single week. And as always, I hope to have you back for the next one.